20, 30 yards away was this thing peeking over this pine bush.
It was a large, hairy animal, dark brown, black hair.
All of a sudden, this creature let out I want to call it a blood-curdling, growling, howling scream.
That's when I realized it wasn't my friend that had snuck up on me.
Dude, all the branches that are broken off are red.
That's crazy. There's no medulla. Hey, it's Mateo. Here's some updates about the website that's coming along. As you can see, we have a forum and we have a podcast and even like videos if you want to look at it from the website itself. But the podcast, we're converting over a lot of our videos into podcasts. So if you want to listen, go check that out. We also have a report encounter. So if you have an encounter, head over there, fill out that form, let us know. And of course, you can check out our About page. And something also really exciting and new is we have merchandise. And you can come check out like mine and Glenn's designs, mainly Glenn's, but there's a lot of cool stuff on there that you can get, and that really helps us here at the channel and promote more field work. And of course, you can also find this on the channel itself, on the YouTube channel, under the store tag. So check that out too. Let us know what you think of those designs, and we'll try to do new ones. And if you're ever locally in the area of Colorado, nearby us, we also do tours. And you can look into that more if you're interested.
Well, absolutely. I think it's interesting. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think that so many people now live in cities. We live in buildings. We don't venture out at night. We watch TV. We're closed in more and more.
Yeah.
I've talked to so many hunters that say, I've been out hunting. There's just weird stuff out there. They won't say what it is.
Yeah.
They'll just say it's weird. It's weird outdoor stuff.
Yeah.
They're on the fringes of society because they're actually getting outside. I mean, what percentage of people actually, specifically in America, actually live outside? Get outside. Not okay, but not many people relatively. And of those people, how many people encounter some of these cryptids? Even a smaller percentage, right? So It's like when you got the guy watching TV who says, there's no such thing. Well, because you don't leave your 4 rooms of your living room and get off your couch.
Yeah.
Or outside of the city. So I think it kind of does get back to the older, the outside people, the not the hunter-gatherer, well, maybe hunter-gatherers, before they were more in touch with what was going on the out there,
Absolutely, and even in this country, it's only been a few generations since we were that close, to the natural world. I mean, if you look at the population statistics and the demographics of the time between 1790 and 1820, I mean, by that time, still 98% of the population were farmers of some kind, and so they were out in it. And these are the kind of demographic and social environments in which these stories often emerge, because these are the people that are experiencing them. It's the same with folklore all over the world. There's that component of connectivity between the human or group of humans in the natural world. And like you say, you point out very well that, in our modern age, outside of a camping trip here and there, most of us don't, interact, intersect, fill in the blank with the natural world.
And even then we're camping in a camper.
It's usually good, unless you're hardcore, but it's usually glamping and not camping.
Yeah. No, it's pretty well. Okay, so I guess this kind of goes around. So these folkloric interactions with something out there.
Mm-hmm.
If you had to play a bet, I mean, if you had to lay a bet, would you say, yeah, they were encountering things out there, right? They were encountering physical somethings out there that we have just lost touch with? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, there's a case to be made, as I sort of sporadically laid out, but there's a case to be made that we've always been experiencing these things because they've always been there. Go ahead.
Go on. Well, it struck me as like, I'm coming from a Christian perspective as well. Mm-hmm. And, the Exodus story, right, as they're going through the Exodus, and there's this whole within the camp mentality, right, within the community, within the camp, and the whole sending the goat out to Azazel, out into the wilderness, right, where it belongs. That even at that point, there's a mentality of there's society, there is safety within our community, and that without our community is a scary place. Whether it's a theological argument or just a physical argument.
Right, and I that's certainly true of the ancient Hebrews, but it's true of any society. There's there's safety in the community. That's where our daily life is. That's where our families are. That's where we're protected. We can protect each other. It's the other, whatever that other may be. It could be people. It could be groups of people. It could be animals. It could be predators. It could be fill in the blank. It could be nebulous fears. It could be not so nebulous fears. But you make a good point about the community and the other being a sort of cultural intersection of how those how those for fear those fears, which are often there are mechanisms within the culture that keep them perpetuated, often for good reason. But yeah, that's an interesting point. And with you referenced the atonement sacrifice, the Azazel goat. When you attach something like an entity like Azazel, who, if we're to believe Enoch and the apocryphal stuff, was a really bad dude. There's a reason why the Hebrews called the atonement sacrifice the Azazel goat, because he's basically ascribed all sin in the apocryphal literature. And you're going to find analogs, for these kinds of things in other cultures as well. That's a good example of the theological / supernatural intersecting with the cultural / ecological element, which is what it's things like that interest me as a biblical scholar and an anthropologist. I can see the intersection.
Yeah. I don't mean to blather here because I'm known to blather. So
it's your show, blather.
No, I just find all this really interesting because there's as an artist, I paint murals, I do decorative art and stuff. I look at iconography and stuff, and some of the iconography from the Babylon, a fish guy, right? The head of a fish.
One of the Apkallu.
Yeah, where did that idea come from? Where did the idea, I'm going to stick the head of a jackal or whatever on top of the noose. Right. I'm going to mash these things together, right? If it's just simply cultural explanations of an idea, that a culture has.
Well, let's look at that for example. Those sages, the reason they have the fish on their head is because they were sent by Enki, and Enki was basically one of his affiliations was with the water, And so if you ever look at Enki, he has like water and fish like coming, like spouting from him, kind of. But if you look even further to the east, you'll see that we had the same sages. I'm pretty sure it's 7 sages in the Sanskrit.
7 sages.
Yeah,
that's right.
For the Sanskrit as well. So you can actually probably see like a movement like from the east moving to the west. So if you want to look at even more ancient like iconography and mythology and stories that are older probably than the Sumerians, just go east. The further east you go, it seems to be older and older. You see like a Shiva with the trident that we later see like in Greek, and even like Enki held a trident that eventually became Poseidon. Vice versa. Even the dragon.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Mateo. There are schools of thought that think that the Western material in the ancient Near East is older, and then there are schools that think that the Vedic Sanskrit material is older. There may be some diffusion there too, because we know that the Sumerians were trading with even the pre-Vedic peoples in the Indus River Valley, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa.
They just found out that it wasn't through the river, that it was all through the well systems that they rose their agriculture from. That was super exciting.
Yeah, which sort of throws the old 18th century hydraulic despotisms thesis out the window.
Assumptions,
But I mean, whatever the source is, I mean, water was the key, which is why it becomes such an elemental figure, I think, in ancient religion, ancient mythology, and why figures like Enki and all the in all of his many faces in the mythologies of that part of the world become so important. But yeah, as to Glenn's question, why, were these actual things that people saw, in real space and time? I tend to think so. That it doesn't negate, just the pure mythological cultural value of the stuff, but I'm always reminded of, when significant paradigmatic cultural changes take place in culture, where you have a kind of 90-degree angle shift. It's a drastic, foundation shaking change. That kind of change doesn't usually come about unless it's from an outside force,
an event.
And you can. I always think of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Where he does a really good job of telling the history of the world, but along the lines of geography and epidemiology and basic cultural development, civilization.
Domesticating
the climax of the book is the clash between the old world and the new world. And he picks Cajamarca, in the Incan Empire, and the clash between Pizarro and Atahualpa. But what's really interesting is that there were all of these sort of distal events thousands of years before that position people from the old world to be in a place where they could more or less easily subjugate the indigenous population of the New World, that have almost nothing to do with things like, I want to be careful here, but they have almost nothing to do with, or at least minimally to do with, the military aspect of that clash. He points out that the Eurasian continent is long east to west, which allowed the spread of domestication of plants and animals and metallurgy and things like that to spread rather easily, because it's the same climate, similar climate. You don't have a lot of big landmarks that you would have to cross, whereas the Americas long north to south, and you have every climate in the world and mountain ranges and all of that to have to deal with. And so the spread of technology and civilization was much, much slower because of that. And then you have things like the disease factor, where herd animals were part of that process in the old world. And we, those of us who are from old world descent, we basically got inoculated from being around herd animals, pigs and sheep and bovine animals in particular, when it came to things like anthrax and especially smallpox, which were just dangerously virile in the New World and decimated, much of the population. And so you combine all of these things, geography, epidemiology, the spread of technology, even before you get to the whole conquering mindset of the conquistador and the military, and you guys are pagans and you deserve to be even before you get to all of that, there are all these other things that set up the old world to invade the new world, and the culture that exists after that is one of these 90-degree angle changes, and it's brought on because of this significantly superior, technologically superior, fill in the blank, outside influence that has this not only drastic influence in terms of change, but in many cases negative, because the population is greatly diminished. The population is subjugated. And this is one example of many. Cargo cults would be another example in the South Pacific. You spin the globe through space and time, and you're going to find these kinds of examples. But these drastic 90-degree angle changes don't just happen. Statistically, they happen because of some sort of outside influence. And when you plug in the possibility of, however you want to contextualize them, extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional, celestial, whatever, we may be using it, that may be semantics at the end of the day.
Right.
But if you have that kind of outside influence, it becomes, the kind of changes that happened circa 12,000, 11,000 BC, beginning about that window, the late Pleistocene, those kind of changes began to take on the hue of reality, especially when you consider, again, for the bulk of our history, we've been hunter-gatherers. It's only been a very, very small fraction of our existence on this planet as a species that we've lived in cities and thought like city-dwelling people. It was something that was very alien to us, before that.
Well,
and so these changes in culture and mythology and our technology at that time, to my mind, were probably brought about by a significant paradigmatic shift brought on by some sort of outside influence.
well, it isn't. I'm going to mangle the name. Maybe not. Gobekli Tepe, or
Gobekli. You did mangle it. Gobekli Tepe.
I read somewhere about that initially they thought, well, it was built up after the farmlands were built, right, around it to support this temple complex.
Yeah.
And now it's like, no, the temple complex came first and everybody came to it.
Yes.
Is that,
yes,
did I get that right?
That's absolutely right. The late Klaus Schmidt, who was the archaeologist that did most of the work on Gobekli Tepe, but he came to that thesis after years of working there. But he believed, as do the other archaeologists that have worked there, that it was religion that came first, and cities and agriculture were epiphenomenal. That's why I used to tell my students that Gobekli Tepe is the paradigm that breaks the paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
it's brought on so many challenges to what we consider, about the origins of civilization, and what is civilization, what is a city-state, how do they emerge, and even if other city-states emerge in later millennia because of farming. It seems that the earliest settlements, and Gobekli Tepe is not your typical settlement anyway. It's not a city in the proper sense. If anything, it had people coming and going. And you probably had a priesthood of a sorts that lived there year round. But it's very clear that you had, on the periphery of this place, you had settlements, where people came and went, to come to this place. But yeah, that's true. The supernatural religious element came first. Agriculture, all of that came later in the case of Gobekli Tepe, and that seems to be true of a cluster of sites in eastern Turkey associated with Gobekli Tepe as well.
Because normally it was always assumed that agriculture had to be a prerequisite before
yeah,
organization and logistics that people could cooperate together to make something like Gobekli Tepe.
The assumption being that and that may have been, that certainly seems to have been the case, in the old Veer Gordon Child Neolithic Revolution hypothesis, where the earliest city-states that they knew about were in places like, Mesopotamia, the Indus River Valley, the Nile River Valley. But now it's very clear, if we're going to use those same criteria that we judge early civilizations like that, we're going to have to reassess these earlier settlements like Gobekli Tepe, but especially places like pre-Israelite Jericho, Tel Kermel in Syria, Chatal Hayat, which is also in Turkey. These are very clearly city-states. If we're to judge use those same general criteria that we've always talked about, in describing a civilization.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just realizing that, especially Western civilization, especially American Western civilization, we tend to have written off religion as a general rule, right? We've become very scientific, very technological, very, whatever, right? Very rational, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And have lost the context of the ancients, that they had a much more religious worldview, right? That they had something else going on. And if we can't even draw on that to help interpret what we're finding, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we can't say, oh, I can understand a religious thing here with practically, right? I can see that as being a real challenge when it comes to interpreting when you find some very ancient thing. It's like, well, of course it would have to be, that the religion came after the agriculture. It's like, no.
Well, I mean, the empiricism has its place. I mean, we need scientific inquiry, to sometimes to get at questions of religion. It's just that we live with the legacy of not that it's completely negative, but we live with some of the negative legacies of the age of enlightenment, when we became so all of our disciplines had to be compartmentalized, and that's not really how ancient peoples thought. Anthropologists figured this out pretty quickly from doing work, amongst people who were non-literate and pre-industrial, because they were still thinking, like that mythology and philosophy and economics and, the equivalent of sciences, it was all one, inner working, cohesive body of knowledge. There's a really good book called Hamlet's Mill, written, I think, back in the 70s. It's gone through several reprintings, but a really interesting take on the ancient world, people, civilizations and cultures that were coming out of the hunter-gatherer mentality and going into the city-state mentality were still thinking mythologically like, very much like their prehistoric forebears. And the way they conceptualized their world was against the blanket of mythology, but it didn't negate the sciences, because obviously, they were doing higher order mathematics. They had a form of calculus without calling it that, because they were building these huge monuments, right? So that they were able to do engineering. What was interesting about their thesis was that their religion and theology was put against the backdrop of the stars and the movement of celestial bodies, these celestial bodies that they associated with their gods and demigods and stories. Their movements corresponded with those stories, and by becoming familiar with the night sky, you're able to extrapolate. Through astronomy, you can extrapolate calculus. If you can do that, then you can engineer. And so the point that they were making is that all of their bodies of knowledge were this cohesive, interacting, whole machine.
It's really cool, like when you point that out, because it's true. It's really hard for us to really, like, when you read ancient text, at first glance, from our perspective, our perception, to really see this integration of, it's a science in itself, like integrated within it. And that's why when they talk about always all the time, like the gods, like created destinies and showed them like time and measurements. They did, like they looked up at the stars to find it. One of the things that helped me the most is, like, I read like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, super hard to read. I've read a lot of like the Sumerian like translations, a little easier to read, but really helped me put everything together. Was like Plato's dialogues, Timaeus, like talking about like where the gods came from, because it came from like a language and style that I could understand, and I could do cross compare it and realize, oh, okay, that's the way they're perceiving it. And now when I read these texts, it's a lot easier to understand like what they're saying, because sometimes like it sounds like they'll personalize a god, but the god is actually there. Like Inan, she's like Venus, right? Like a Venus shining upon me. So it sounds like in the text, like, oh, she was with me, like to help me, and you think she's right there, but in their perception she was, because in other translations, like right below it, it's in the same like translation, it'll say, I saw her shining upon me, but that's her physically being there with you. But for us, we perceive it like separate, a separation. But there is no separation between the two.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the dangers of the hermeneutics of these ancient texts, is that we have to be so careful that we're, that we get as much of the cultural context in which these things are written. And even speaking of other ancient Near Eastern documents, with the Bible, you run into the same sorts of things. Context is lost all of the time, but just because a lot of translators won't let the words say what they're saying, again, the whole thing about the giants, the Nephilim, that's a big point of contention, even amongst biblical scholars, to this day. But the fact of the matter is that, hey, regardless of what you believe, this is what these people believed, and you need to read that text as much as you possibly can in the modern world. You need to read that text thinking like, this particular culture, in this case, the ancient Hebrews. And that's why context is key, and it's otherwise we're guilty of one of the highest historical crimes. We're guilty of presentism, projecting our values onto those particular texts.
Hard to get away from that, though. It's just
exactly. I mean, and that was, I can think back to my, when I was just, a green graduate student, the first anthropology seminar that I was in, I was scared to death. I was like, oh God, I'm out of my league here. And this guy's talking about, bias and all the bias that you carry into it. And here I am, fresh off of my bachelor's degree. I'm thinking, yeah, bias, whatever. We got to be as unbiased as we possibly can. But you discover, whether you have alphabet soup after your name or not, when you get into this stuff, you discover very quickly that you carry your own biases, and some of them you can't get away from altogether.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as a rule of thumb, any serious consideration, any investigation, particularly with ancient documents, you want to get in the mind of that culture as much as you possibly can. And you can you don't have to be an ancient Near Eastern languages specialist to do that. There's so many, there are good translations that are in public domain that people can access. There are all kinds of commentaries. In some cases, the Akkadians and the Sumerians wrote their own commentaries, wrote their own grammars, which have also been translated, which can help you a lot. The same is true of the Egyptian material and also the biblical material. So that it just depends on how studious people want to be about it.
Well, that's another thing is I think we all get very lazy when it comes to we just come in with our preconceived notions, our biases right in front of us, which makes our viewpoint the size of a pinhole, right? We only see what we want to see, whether it's Sasquatch, Dogman, or whatever,
Right.
That trying to bring back to this. But I mean, it's, when Mateo was commenting there about Inanna and Venus and shining on me and stuff, right? I wanted to push back on that a little bit and say, okay, but isn't that potentially our bias coming in and reading this ancient text? Our scientific bias saying that is simply the beam shining on me.
Well, because my assumption, right, in the beginning was like, oh, well, she's right there because that's why I was reading it. But it was still literal, right? Like, it's still, like, I was taking it literal, but still they were speaking literal too. So even though, like, my bias said, oh, well, Venus as goddess is right there with them. Same like with, like in the battles in Egypt where they talk about these gods and goddesses riding with them. But then like in the same verse, they'll talk about, oh, how like they're shining their light from like a star or the sun. And then like it makes it easier because at first like you're just like, well, okay, obviously like it's just like this deity that's either like made up or exists, but what it looks like is it's real. It's a very literal thing. We're just the way we're trying to perceive it is literal, like the way we see it in context, not the way they have seen it in context. And that was like a huge like kind of like an epiphany for me to have this realization that it's still very literal. That when they talk about the Nuna or the heavens, the God, it's literal. Like it's not like this mythical thing. It's really there. Like they're talking about a real thing.
Well, I think there's room for both positions. If especially when you consider that these people represented their gods not only by celestial objects but also often in anthropomorphic form, and getting back, again, coming full circle to the sort of chimerical, in some cases, as in the case of Enki, you have these sort of chimerical features of the gods. One of the many reasons that I think that the ancient peoples experienced their gods up close and personal is because of the, almost without fail, not only were the earliest political systems in these city-states, not only were they monarchies, but they were theocratic monarchies. And whereas you have, religion and politics riding in the same cart, essentially, where the earliest of kings were seen either as gods themselves or emissaries of the gods or demigods of some sort, which is an idea that carries on throughout history. Even in Western tradition, when the big European city-states, or the European nation-states began emerging, and the kings and queens of Europe thought that they were, directly appointed by God, there was still that kernel of legacy standing back. But in the ancient world, it's very mingled. You know, there's either the peoples are saying not that they're you know, that their kings are necessarily fully human. You know, when you consider not just the pharaohs, but I'm also thinking about in Mesopotamian tradition, figures like Gilgamesh, you know, who not only shows up in the Gilgamesh epic, but we actually find his name on the Sumerian kings list too, as the king of the city-state of Uruk. So, you know, when you've got one element there that's purely historical, one that we would consider purely mythological, and yet, you know, you do have these points of connectivity. So was there this you know, anthropomorphic person, entity, whatever, who was 2/3 divine, actually ruling over these city-states? And again, this brings us back to that 90-degree paradigm shift taking place, you know, on planet Earth between about 10,000 and 3,000 BC. It just seems to me that there's room to consider that there was an outside cultural influence that caused these kinds of changes. So I think there's room for both. There's room for looking at, you know, the ancient peoples considering their gods embodied in celestial bodies, but also I think that there's also room for the possibility that the gods actually did come down and intermingle and rule for a time over humanity.
Well, I mean, everything that I've seen so far from the ancient texts, like, seems to have more literal, like, connections instead of, like, just metaphorical. Mm-hmm. You know, so maybe that, like to support, like, your statements, so in whatever context that may be, yeah, maybe it is suggesting more than just, like, the way I've interpreted, that there were actually, like, these entities or beings, whoever you want. I don't know. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I'm not putting the ancient alien spin on this necessarily.
Yeah,
I've got all kinds of problems with the people that Sitchin, I think, was completely out of his league in terms of.
It was really disappointing when I went to go cross-reference, like, the translations he used and see how he cherry-picks things.
Clearly had no training, you know, in any of the Mesopotamian languages.
It's selective editing.
Yeah, really selective. You know, I mean, one example is, you know, I mean, the whole, Nibiru. You've got a word here that's within the context of Mesopotamian astrology, which was basically the same thing as astronomy. You know, there was no dividing line, you know, in that world, but Nibiru is always referenced as Marduk's star. Well, that was Jupiter. That was not some road. I mean, we know that. We not only know that from our work in translating those texts, but the commentaries that these ancient peoples actually wrote make that very explicit. And, you know, just think of all the millions of dollars that Sitchin fleeced out of people, you know.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's a lot of people like that, which make it harder for us to trust anyone. He
has people that are carrying the torch to this day, and my problem is that the material that they're addressing is fascinating, and
the way it weaves together
deserves consideration. But you know, there's one guy who I won't name him because it's not really necessary, but he approaches these texts and says that his source for commentary are the etymological notes in the Webster's Dictionary. Well, if you're reading through, you know, a Sumerian or Akkadian text, those notes are not going to do you very much good. At the very least, you need some sort of commentary, and at most, you need, you know, some serious training in those languages, which this fellow has absolutely none. But he makes millions of dollars selling his books and taking these, giving these woo-woo tours in places like Egypt and Turkey, and it just infuriates me.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. So like, I'm gonna drop names. What's his name? Like I was one of those people when I was a kid. I would read like David Childress, all these other people
I was
that
the
like
same way.
that were they mesh this thing together that looks really nice. It makes sense as it is, but then once you start like reading the context and learning on your own, you find out like they cherry pick this stuff. They cherry pick to make it sound good, and now what they've created is like this illusion, which isn't anything based like off like what the truth might be. And the sad thing is, there's a lot of mystery still within like the actual like ancient text itself. Like there's so much mystery out there from the past in the literature, but they like just create like this abomination to make money and like looking for truth, and it kind of like took years off my life of research and like study because I adopted that, and at the time there wasn't like easy access to these materials, like to actually read them in like their raw format to better understand like context and reference.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
Okay, ignorance, decorative artist talking here. Okay. I know there's and I can't. It's a hierarchical of the size of the figures when you do a carving, right? The bigger the figure, the bigger the king, right?
Right.
There is some Egyptian carving where the slaves are giants, right? I forget.
Yes.
It starts with the S.
Yeah, you referenced the Shazu. You're referencing the plate that commemorates the Battle of Kadesh.
Right. So I mean that's curious. That kind of breaks that evidently breaks the rule of hierarchy of importance or size of importance.
It erodes the hierarchy. I think you're referring to the hierarchy of scale.
Yeah. Now, just as an artist, that intrigues me because like, okay, well that I was following that and that made sense, but here this is breaking this rule. Now this is where I know you've gotten a book on giants and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now sorry to interrupt really quick. I'm gonna go to the restroom. You guys keep talking. I can't hold it anymore. I'm so sorry.
Okay. So sorry. I'll make this really quick, but this is just something that's stuck in my head. Saul is supposed to be taller than anybody else, right? Like a head and a half taller, or a head taller than everybody else. King Saul.
Mm-hmm.
King Saul. I was wondering if that wasn't a cultural legacy of the giants, that there's something special about him, not just that he's physically taller than everybody, but there is a religious significance to he must be closer to God, because we know Gilgamesh was bigger. We know that all these guys that were closer to the deity, whatever, were bigger and taller.
Yeah.
Or they had spiritual, whatever lineage. Mm-hmm. And they now look at Saul and go, "Hey, I bet you I never thought that up until about 3 weeks ago." And I've never heard anybody talk about that.
Well, it's certainly possible. The Hebrews, whined and complained, but they didn't have a king like their neighbors. So there's an argument there to be made for that kind of cultural diffusion, because they were just right there amongst the tribes of the Levant, the Canaanites, and the Philistines, and these other groups, Moabites. So I suppose you could make an argument to an extent, but the you also have to remember that the ancient Hebrews, even with all of this cultural diffusion, were they were still being guided by their priesthood.
Absolutely, no, I'm not saying that, but I guess I'm just thinking that okay, pendulum swing from this is just cultural to the pendulum swing of all these. This was Lord of the Rings over here, and we had giants and dwarves and all this stuff, and that swing back and forth, right?
Mm-hmm.
When these people meet Dogman here in Colorado, right? That's a very tangible thing, which makes me want to go to that side of the pendulum swing and saying, there's something very, very real, very tangible. It's not just cultural.
Yeah.
It's very real. When I look at the Shasu sculptures, that kind of breaks that rule. And when I think about Saul, King Saul being taller, it's like, man, I wonder if that was something that they were thinking. And so again, it's that pendulum swing as I'm trying to discern truth in the midst of all this weirdness.
Yeah, and it's hard to point to, we all want the smoking gun. As an archaeologist, I would love to have an articulated skeleton, one of these things. But there are these compelling, little bits of evidence, like the discovery of the Goliath shard at Tel Shafi, which was the ancient city of Gath, one of the 5 main cities of the Philistines. Here you've got this potsherd, and not just a potsherd that clearly shows the name of Goliath, but in the same town, on one of the doorposts, I think was spelled out the name Rop, which would be a shortening of Repha, or Rip from the Rephaim. Goliath was associated with the Rephaim and the Anakim. But you've got, again, that's not a smoking gun, but that's pretty compelling because it shows up in the right stratum. That's 10th, 9th century BC. You're talking the right territory for the classic, during the Battle of Elah, when Goliath and David, sort of far. And that's kind of interesting too, because West Asian armies didn't fight like that. Like, they didn't pick champions. That's like something out of Homer, with Achilles and Hector, facing off. And I have my reasons for thinking why that was. But what I'm trying to say is that there are, and again, even at Tel Shafi, they've also found these larger houses there as well. And mainstream academia says, well, that's the reason they thought that there were giants here. The other possibility is that there were these people that were 8-9 feet tall that were actually living there that needed these houses to be that big.
Right. Instead of making a doorway that's really big just to be a representation that this is an important building.
I think if we go by
potentially that door is built big because we need a big door.
I think if we were to
go, it's kind of interesting. I don't know.
I think if we were to go by literary evidence, go by literary evidence alone, in not just here in the Americas but also in the Old World, I think it's pretty clear that there were like a whole races and people of a very much higher stature.
Yeah.
I think it'd be foolish to say there wasn't. Obviously, we don't know exactly where they came from. If they just
physical dimensions,
hominid, or if they were just like
societal stature, but higher stature as in physically larger. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, even the Spanish, when they in their chronicles in the Americas, they talk about writing into groups of people that were very tall, and they were part of the monarchy of these different tribes and cultures and civilizations. There's even pictures in Patagonia of very tall stature like natives that were that we were able to get actual pictures of. It's not very much, but it's there. What gets me is I was just a few years ago I was watching this PBS special working with Smithsonian, and it was the director himself. They were talking about, it was the Manifest Destiny episode, right? Talking about how admitting that they actually did conceal things for many years. This is the director of the Smithsonian, and then he goes on, and this blew my mind, that he found out that the Cahokia Mounds people had iron technology, which puts them thousands of years more advanced than we ever assumed. And that's huge. Right. That's huge, and he was just as surprised because he had always, been told they only made it copper technology. So I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there were definitely people of high stature and like where they came from. That's what I want to know. You know, like that's
and there's some real. There's actually go ahead.
I'm sorry. I've got to run. This is a lovely conversation. I've got to run. I know we're starting to get into your wheelhouse, Judd.
Well,
but I mean, I've got to run. I don't know how to shut this off.
Let's
not shut it off and let you guys run this.
Well, if you let's do you want to have another time with us session so we can just keep going over this stuff? Would you like that?
Yeah, sure.
All right, let's just do that. So then we can all still be involved and throw stuff.
I would love that.
Because I really like this for this series, right? I just find it kind of like it just explore all kinds of views and perspectives, and not have it like because obviously like we have like the Sasquatch thing where we're doing right now in the field, and we're just using like a very empirical method. But this channel is about actually just exploring in general, not just Sasquatch. That's just where it's come to. You know,
there's a lot of overlap in the material. I mean, we're to use a line from Mrs. Amworth by E.F. Benson. We're all trying to chart the misty and perilous places.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Awesome,
gentlemen. I'm sorry. I do have to run.
That's fine. Let's wrap this up then. And then we'll do another appointment, and we'll all like for like an episode 2 kind of thing. How's that sound?
Excellent.
Sounds good.
All right.
Dr. Judd, is there anything that you need to say at the end, like how to contact you, where to look, what you've got going on?
Oh, yeah. People can go to my website, burtonbeyond.com. The Institute of Biblical Anthropology is tioba.org. People can follow me on Twitter. I've got YouTube. Probably the book that would be most pertinent to this would be Interview with the Giant, because there's a lot of chimerical material in there too. I've got a new one coming out soon called The Van Helsing Way, which also has a whole chapter on werewolves and were creatures, which would probably be of interest to your audience. And I actually should have about 8 books done by the end of the year. So
awesome.
It's been a hefty writing season for me.
Excellent. If you can email me that list, that'd be awesome. And we can add that to the end of this in the description here.
Yeah, you bet.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much, Judd. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And look forward to talking to you some more in the future.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
I appreciate it, Judd. Be well.
You bet.
Thank you. Have a great day. Appreciate it so much.
We'll see you, Mateo.
Cheers.
Take care.
Be well.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Hey kid, don't ever let them get inside your head. They'll tell you what to do in life instead of everything you know that you could get. Don't let them guide your life towards regret. I'll fight for what I love with every breath. My past is filled with things I won't forget. I use them all to push me to my best. So treat the worst of times just like a test. If only I could go back in time, I'd tell myself that everything will end up alright. Just push yourself, test yourself, figure out what you like, and find your limits, don't be rigid, always work towards a prime. Surround yourself with open minds, people can change your life. A few friends with intent can help you feel alive. Find a passion, take some action, and with a little time, just be patient, make a statement, try to enjoy your life. They'll try to kick you while you're down. They wanna rise up while you drown. They wanna fill your head with doubt. They're silently scared that you'll figure it out. I'll make it look like I'm losing, won't bother hiding my bruises. And when they finally think you're wounded, then it's your chance to be ruthless.